2006 American Renaissance Conference was the seventh and largest held to date. It was held outside of Washington, D.C., attesting to the global significance and consequences of the issues that face us today. Speakers came from all over the world, including Britain, Australia, South Africa, Canada, and France. The roster of speakers for this conference included political activists, professors, researchers, authors, who addressed the topics such as diversity and the price of liberty and free speech, science and racial differences, as well as their consequences, and the rise of militant Islam. Not only was this the largest conference in attendance, but it was also well covered by the press. Demonstrators appeared in front to show that the speakers were correct, that diversity and liberty may be incompatible values. An assistant district attorney from New York who was in attendance was fired upon his return home. At the conclusion of the presentations, you'll be given information for contacts for American Renaissance or for Renaissance Audio Visual.
And I hate to interrupt your conviviality here, but we do have a very distinguished speaker this evening. I believe most of you are familiar with Philippe Rushton, but I'll give you some background anyway. He was born in England. His parents emigrated to Canada. He returned to England for his university education and received a PhD at the London School of Economics. He taught at several Canadian universities before settling in at the University of Western Ontario, where he currently teaches. Professor Rushton is probably best known for his work in genetic similarity theory. He'll be touching on that later on this evening, and also for his work in applying RK theory to human races. And in a sane and civilized world, his work would have had worldwide acclaim, and his book, Race, Evolution, and Behavior, is certainly one of the most important volumes on race written in our time. I think it was entirely fitting, therefore, that in March of 2002, Professor Rushton was named president of the Pioneer Fund, which has certainly financed some of the most important race genetic studies of the 20th century. Of course, as you all know, anyone who writes sensibly about race comes under attack. The more sensibly, the heavier the attack. In 1989, the Toronto Sun launched a huge campaign, a furious campaign, to try to have Professor Rushton removed from his post at the university. A number of students launched a human rights violation, charging him with, quote, infecting the learning environment with racism. It took him 4 years to fight those charges to a standstill. At the same time, the Ontario Provincial Police started an investigation as to whether or not he'd violated the criminal code. And after having looked very carefully into the matter, they decided at a heavily attended press conference that Professor Rushton was, quote, loony but not criminal. Now, in these dangerous times, that's a distinction for which one can be grateful. Throughout it all, Professor Rushton has stood his ground, never backed down, never lost his composure, never lost his good cheer. His steadfastness has been an inspiration to us all, and in his quiet determination, he has reduced his opponents to baffled silence. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Philippe Rushton.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Jared, for putting on another wonderful conference. It's a great honor to be the after-dinner speaker, to be elevated up like this. I'm going to present some science, but I'm also hoping to entertain a little bit as well as enlighten. I'm going to talk about two things. One is the importance of genetic similarity in human relationships and the most recent research on that. I'm also going to talk about the race IQ issue because it's, I know, a hoary old topic that goes back 200 years, but I think now it's almost definitively put to bed, at least as far as black-white differences in the United States. I'm going to talk mostly about my own work because, of course, I'm familiar with that. And the real point I want to make, without tooting my own horn too much, is that the research that I'm going to be talking about has all appeared in absolutely the very best scientific journals that there are within the psychology and behavior genetic field. And my point in saying this is to validate the importance of the research and show that this is now becoming absolutely mainstream. It's not fringe science at all. It's still a minority perspective, but it's absolutely mainstream. Okay, I want to start off by going through some similarity slides. If anybody goes to People magazine or Us magazine or looks at celebrities, they're marrying and getting divorced and remarrying, you'll notice very precise and very interesting levels of similarity. In fact, it's almost uncanny. You'll find exceptions to the rule, but anybody can do this research. And if we can go to the next slide. The next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. I mean, just look at it. If you can see that, the shape of the nose is really quite uncanny, similar. The next one. Next. Okay. Tremendous amount of selection went into making this particular couple. And why should people even want to pick similarity in spouses or try to? And the answer is in the next slide. That is, your children look much more similar to you. In fact, they are much more genetically similar to you. Because on average, of course, the man gives 50% of his genes to the child, the female gives 50% of her genes to the child. But if you're sharing genes in common with your spouse, then your child not only gets your 50% from you, but also gets a percentage that you share with your spouse. And so they can be 70 or 80% similar to you. Next slide. But no matter how genetically similar you are or not, there are no guarantees in life. And, next one. You do get a chance sometimes to find happiness with another partner. Next slide. And sometimes that other partner looks uncannily like the previous partner. Yeah, correct for the age difference, and maybe I'm dragging this particular analogy a little too far. So let's go to the next slide. This is the empirical data. If you scour all the scientific journals, you go through all the behavior genetics and psychology journals, and you actually count up over the last 60 or 70 years all the studies that have been done on who people marry or who are their best friends, you find that similarity overwhelmingly trumps opposites. Opposites might very well attract sometimes, but averaging it all out, it's similarity. And it's this, 0.84, which is a very high correlation, for similarity of background, socioeconomic status, age, educational level, and race, and so on. 0.52, which is a pretty high correlation for social attitudes and opinions. It'd be very hard to live with somebody or be friends with somebody who had diametrically opposite views to yourself on, say, ethnic nationalism. IQ scores, 0.37 is the average correlation, still very high. And for physical attributes and personality traits, which I'll unpack a little bit later on, the correlations are 0.15, which is a very low correlation, but it's not zero. The correlations never are zero, and they never are below zero, like negative numbers. So 0.15 is low, but they're consistently positive, even for minute physical characteristics, which I'll come to shortly. Next. Well, how far can